cutting a line from a poem feels better when I know the line doesn't have to be eradicated from the world. It is potentially going to become an organ donor for a future poem that needs a spleen or a kidney that this poem or this line can provide. Hello, I'm Tracy K. Smith. I am the author of Ordinary Light, which was the summer read for many of Meredith's students, and I'm here to answer some questions from students about the work. The first question is, if you could share one thing with students about navigating creative life and life in general, what would it be? I think it's actually the same thing. I came to understand how important community is for writers, and not just having a group of people that you are competing with, which sometimes happens in writing programs, but people whose work you're invested in, people who you might want to alert to different opportunities and who you can inspire and be inspired by. And I think that's probably my answer for life in general, finding people who you love and who you can invest in and trust to invest in your experience as well. The next question is, how do you choose subjects, consciously or more like a feeling that a story needs to be told? Well, I'm mostly a poet, and so I am allowing a lot of things to hit me and sometimes saying, I really want to write a poem about this thing and making a note, or letting questions or worries often that I have bring me to the page to sit down and write poems, which give me a greater grasp not only of how I feel and what the world that I participate in looks and seems like, but also what I hope for and what the world could potentially come to look and feel like if we are able to make certain changes in how we see each other and how we choose to act. So it's a matter of letting things arise and also going after things that need to be explored more fully. I don't write poems about things I feel like I really understand. Unfortunately, I guess there's little that I feel like I truly, truly have gotten to the bottom of, but it's uncertainty and it's a sense of wish or need that again and again brings me to the page. What does your creative process look like at the very beginning of a poem or essay? Well, I start with a question in my mind. It's not always a question that gets uttered on the page, but it's a question that asks me to start looking in different directions. So I write some poems about motherhood and having children, and sometimes those poems become necessary because I feel confused. I feel like it's different than I thought it would be. I don't necessarily have the kind of authority that my parents had, and so I need to start listening to myself and my children differently, and a poem helps me to do that. It also helps me to look more closely at people and experiences, and sometimes looking more closely at something reminds you of how large and complex and miraculous it is. And I think that's true even of the poems that are not about people that I love, but about places, about experiences, even facets of history that might be disconcerting for me. To move toward them in language and imagination often is a matter of being reminded that there are people within moments that might, in general terms, feel difficult or heavy. There are people within those moments who are generous, who offered something made of love and care to others, and that can be a real consolation. So moving towards something by way of a question. And then for me, writing means running out of the knowledge of what to say next very quickly. Maybe I'll write like this far into a poem and then realize I don't know what else to say. So another big part of my process is going back and rereading what I've written and seeing if there's something within that, be it an image or a sound or a pattern of sounds, that I could draw further into the poem, that I could explore a little bit more, that I could leap off from in a new way. And that allows me to keep going. I find that my work is filled with visual images, in large part because I'm also trying to imagine that I can put myself down in the place that I'm thinking about, in the time that I'm thinking about, and in the presence of the people who I'm interested in exploring. And so in order to feel like a realistic encounter is happening, I need to take stock of my surroundings. I need to look and listen and let the senses help draw me into what feels like a real world. And so those elements come into the language of my poem or of the other form of writing that I might be doing. How does teaching and being in conversation with students shape your writing or perspective? I think this is a great question because it wasn't something that I was aware was going to play as huge a role before I started teaching. Students are so inspiring. I ask them to do very difficult things. I ask my students to read a lot of books of poems and write a poem a week. And they do. And they take wild risks in the material. They respond to prompts that are very outrageously prescriptive. And they inspire me with their ability to find real life and real energy in those feats of what begin as duty from a teacher. Teaching, I think, has also made me a better reader of poetry. When I was just reading for myself, I would gravitate toward what I loved, and I would feel satisfied by saying, oh, that was really powerful, or that was very beautiful. But you can't sit down in a classroom and teach only what you love, what you already know, and end the conversation with, isn't this great? So I've found myself forming and expanding my own vocabulary for what poems do. And yes, they produce feelings in the readers, but they also are an effect of very specific choices in language and in form that writers make. And so finding a vocabulary for talking about those things and giving my students a vocabulary to identify those tools, to lift them out of another poet's work and to carry them over into the material of my students' lives is a huge thing. And it actually has taught me that that's how I, as a writer, also can learn and grow. What else? My students have huge hearts and huge consciences. They're very interested in being useful to the world and all of its various challenges and problems. And many of them are students of, various sciences. Many of them are studying history, other art forms, and they bring this knowledge into my classroom where it manifests not only in their poems, but in their observations about the poetry that we're reading and the poems that their peers are writing. So it's, I think it's a form of education to spend time with other people who bring such commitment and such curiosity and insight to the task of reading and writing. In nonfiction, how do you separate what should be told from what should remain private? Sometimes it can be hard to know that distinction until you've written something. And sometimes the need to write means that that's not always a question that's on my mind. And I say that because I'm well aware that I may not end up wanting or needing to publish everything that I write. But I will certainly learn something from the act of attention and revision that the writing requires. But nonfiction is really different from poetry, even poems that are emerging from real life, because there are other people in those texts, and they have feelings about the very same things that you do that might be quite different from yours. And so I think it's a matter of really listening to what feels fair and kind. In my book, the first thing that I did when I felt like I was writing about other people's experience and using my perspective to do so, which is inevitably different from theirs, was to change most of the names in the book. And so that added a layer of privacy to some of the people who do become characters. But there were facets of that story that I chose not to tell or not to publish because though it taught me something, it might not have been worth the kind of difficulty it could have posed for somebody else, somebody in the position of seeing themselves as a character. I'll also say that I didn't get it right 100%. Some of what appears in ordinary light were my versions of experiences that my extended family didn't share the same perspective on. And that was a site of conflict or pain for some time that we had to move through. So it's an imperfect art form in terms of making everyone happy. But I think that the experience of witnessing the effects of your work also bolsters your understanding of what forms of care you want to exercise in the future writing and publishing that you might seek to do. When writing the most difficult parts of your life, what was your mental process or approach to returning to those moments and rendering them on the page? I had to start with what wasn't difficult. So I didn't write the book in order. The book opens with the scene that was the hardest scene for me to write, which is the scene of my mother's passing. And there was a period of time when I thought, maybe I don't have to tell that. But it became clear to me that it was needed. And so I went back to that moment in time. And I did what I always do, which was to bring my memory, bring all of the sensory details, and also to bear witness to what was going on inside. And it became easier than I thought. I felt the presence of my mother in that scene. And as hard as it is to be feeling the presence of someone in a scene where you know they're going to disappear at the end, there was a gift that gave me of just being in the presence of her life at this critical time, this pivotal moment, and to slow it down and to be fully present in it, and not to have the shock of the moment dull my ability to take stock of things. So in some ways it was a gift. Another thing that told me that scene needed to be in the book, which was a difficult realization, was that so much of what I wrote about my early childhood and moments of worry, moments of fear or speculation that didn't come to a dramatic climax in those scenes, I knew they were important to me because my mother did end up passing away. So every time I feared for her safety as a child, the adult self writing those scenes knew why. And it didn't seem fair to hold that knowledge only for myself and not let the reader know that that's what those scenes were doing. And so that critical moment of my mother's death became the first scene in the book, so that we would all, the reader and the author would begin with a similar kind of knowledge of the climax, and that felt fair. All right, the next question. What was the U.S. Poet Laureate role actually like? What did it entail, and what surprised you? The Poet Laureate is a position that many people can fill in different ways. So you can do as much or as little as you want in that role. You can give a reading and give a lecture and be done, or you can create a project. And I was really inspired by other Poets Laureate who had created projects that took them into different regions of America. And so that's what I wanted to do. And I went to rural communities and read poems by other living American poets with groups of people. And we had conversations about what the poems caused us to notice, remember, wonder, and feel. And it was a really exciting opportunity to realize that people of all different backgrounds, different perspectives, and different values can listen to one another very attentively and very generously, and can share with great honesty what was important to them, what we love, what we fear, what we revere. For me, that experience keeps yielding hope. I finished my term right before the pandemic, and so to think about all of those conversations with strangers as something that had happened once and that might be possible again on the other side of the epidemic was really exciting. I think what surprised me most was that even people who didn't believe that they liked poetry could teach me marvelous things about the poems that we read together. And in many ways, it reminded me that everybody is filled with insight. Everybody is a resource for learning and seeing things differently, and sometimes seeing things better than we do on our own. What does it mean to you personally to have your work become part of students' education in settings like this? It's a tremendous honor to imagine or to know that students are being asked to read my work and to find meaning and insight or inspiration within it. I hope that means they're thinking about what I've done in terms of my craft that they might seek to do. And I know it also means that they're thinking, she did this, but I'm interested in doing this other thing. I want to go past what she's done. And I think that's a really beautiful position to be in, to say, here's something that you can use to do something completely different, wildly different with. And I also know what it means to me to be living my life years after I was a student and have a scene from a book that I read 30 years ago become apparent in my mind because it's useful to a feeling or an experience that I'm dealing with in the present. And so I'm grateful and hopeful that some of what people encounter in my work might be useful to them in moments of their life way down the line when they're not even thinking about literature. How do you know a poem is finished? And do you ever rethink lines that you cut? I start to get the feeling that the poem I'm writing might be nearing its end when it begins to teach me things or reveal things to me that I didn't know at the outset. And that always feels like a miracle, that something I'm writing that's made of my own vocabulary and imagination can teach me something. But it often happens. And when that starts to occur, I realize that if I can attend to the formal choices that the poem is making, and if I can make sure that there's nothing present that doesn't need to be there, the poem might become a realized piece of art. And I don't always get it right the first time. Sometimes I edit wildly and delete things that, yes, I end up rethinking and putting back in. More often, revision is a process that takes more than 1 or 2 or 3 sittings, because I don't yet know how to fix a problem or how to make a kind of shift or leap that the poem seems to need. And reading the work of other poets is one way of gathering a little bit of insight into how to go about rethinking my own poems. I'll say one more thing about that. Cutting a line from a poem feels better when I know the line doesn't have to be eradicated from the world. When I can just say it's going to be on my hard drive and it is potentially going to become an organ donor for a future poem that needs a spleen or a kidney that this poem or this line can provide. So it's actually very exciting to know that they can be repurposed in other ways. Of all your work, is there a single piece or line you're most proud of, and why? I don't know that I would say I'm most proud of the work I'm about to share, but I'm most grateful. It's one of the works that I'm most grateful for, and it's a poem called "I Will Tell You the Truth About This, I Will Tell You All About It." It's a poem that is about the experience of African-American soldiers and their family members during the Civil War. And I thought I was going to do some research and then write a poem in my own voice that moved around that time period and explored those experiences. But I started reading letters that these people, these actual people, had written to their family members or to President Abraham Lincoln, and statements that they had made to federal offices asking for care, asking for consideration that they hadn't been receiving, and after the war asking for their pensions that they as U.S. veterans ought to have been entitled to, but to which many were having a hard time getting access because they had been enslaved. So they didn't have all the documentation of citizens, others who hadn't been in that position. I learned so much from listening to their voices that my voice does not enter that poem at all. It's a collage of their stories, and they're expressions of need and hope. Much of it is hope for the future. And I'm so grateful that poem changed my relationship to my art form, because it taught me that a poem doesn't necessarily need my voice. Sometimes what a poem needs is me to create an opportunity to listen, to curate a space where a reader could also sit down with me at the feet of other actual people and listen with the attention that we bring to poetry, to their human stories. So yeah, that's one of the pieces I'm incredibly grateful to have been able to create. When you visit campuses like Meredith, what do you hope students take away from engaging with you? I would say I hope that they gather a sense that they can do what I do in their own way. They can find their own material or honor the material that they live with and maybe are aware of, but haven't quite decided whether or not it would make it to a poem or a book of nonfiction or fiction. And I guess I also hope that they might be reminded that poetry and literature in general are beautiful tools, not just for escaping from the stresses and the burdens of the day-to-day world that we live in, but for reigniting our commitment to the other people in the worlds that we move through. I think that's really at the heart of my project as an artist, and I think in many ways it's what literature exists to do, to say there are other people in the world and their stories, even if they're fictional, can make us more curious about strangers in our midst and more beholden to the wisdom and the beauty that they bring to this life. And I'll end on that note. That's the last question. So thank you so much.